Alright, let's get into this, because ancient punishments were not messing around. And by the end of this video, you're going to be very, very grateful you live in the era of community service and not the era of getting fed to crocodiles for jaywalking. Here's the thing people don't realize about ancient justice systems: they weren't really about justice, they were about spectacle. Punishment wasn't just something that happened to a criminal, it was something that happened in front of everybody, on purpose. Ancient courts didn't have prisons the way we think of them today. Locking someone in a cell for years costs money, food, guards, and infrastructure. Way easier and way cheaper to just make an example out of somebody, publicly, loudly, painfully. And once you understand that one core idea, literally everything else in this video is going to make a horrifying amount of sense. So buckle up, because we're about to travel through 6,000 years of human history's worst Tuesdays, across nearly every continent, and I promise you, it only gets weirder from here. Let's start at the very beginning, in ancient Mesopotamia, home of the first cities, the first writing system, and, conveniently for this video, the first written law code. Around 1754 BC, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi decided he was tired of judges just making stuff up, so he carved 282 laws into a massive stone pillar called a stele and stuck it right in the middle of the city for everyone to see. And look, on paper this sounds pretty progressive. Written laws, consistency, everyone knows the rules. Except then you actually read the laws, and you realize Hammurabi's idea of consistency was mostly an eye for an eye. If you broke into someone's house, the punishment was death. And not just any death, they'd execute you right there at the hole you dug to break in and then bury you in it, which is either poetic or just extremely inconvenient for whoever owned that house. If a builder built a house and it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was put to death. If it killed the owner's son instead, they'd execute the builder's son. Babylonian law occasionally skipped the actual criminal entirely and just punished their kid because apparently your family's life was considered your collateral. And if a woman was caught cheating on her husband, both her and her lover were tied together and thrown into the river to drown, unless the husband felt like being merciful then, which, fun fact, was entirely his personal call. Justice, Babylonian style, was less about fairness and more about making sure the punishment was memorable enough that nobody in the marketplace would forget it by lunchtime. Now let's hop over to ancient Egypt, a civilization we usually picture as pyramids, gold, and cats being worshipped like tiny furry gods. But behind all that glamour was a legal system that took wrongdoing extremely personally, because in Egyptian belief, committing a crime wasn't just breaking a human rule, it was disrupting Ma'at, this cosmic concept of order, balance, and truth that literally held the universe together. So a criminal wasn't just a criminal. They were a walking threat to reality itself. No pressure. Punishments varied depending on the crime, but a lot of them were built around a very Egyptian obsession. Your body needed to be intact for the afterlife. So let's mess with that. Thieves could have their hands cut off. Perjurers, people who lied under oath, could have their tongues or noses removed. And workers caught being lazy or skipping their shift, they got beaten with sticks, sometimes right in front of their coworkers, which, honestly, might be the most effective productivity software ever devised. Way more motivating than a performance review. But the punishment Egyptians considered truly catastrophic wasn't physical pain at all. It was the denial of burial. If your crime was serious enough, they wouldn't just execute you, they'd make sure your body was never properly mummified or buried with the right ritual. To an ancient Egyptian, that wasn't just death, that was eternal death. No afterlife, no eternal paradise, nothing. Just oblivion, which honestly might be the scariest sentence on this entire list, and nobody even had to touch you. Let's stay in the ancient Near East a moment longer and swing over to Persia, because the Achaemenid Persians developed a reputation, partly earned, partly exaggerated by their Greek rivals who really did not like them, for extremely theatrical executions. One method that shows up repeatedly in ancient sources is called scaphism, sometimes nicknamed the boats. Now, modern historians are genuinely skeptical about how often or even if this was actually carried out versus being ancient Greek propaganda designed to make Persia look barbaric by comparison. But whether it's fully true or partly legend, it tells you something important that we're going to keep circling back to today. Reputation was a weapon all on its own. Sometimes just being known as the civilization that invents horrifying punishments did just as much deterrent work as actually carrying them out. Moving over to ancient Greece, You know, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, the Olympics, all that civilized stuff, and yet their punishments still had this dark, theatrical streak running through them. Take Athens under a lawmaker named Draco, around 620 BC. Draco wrote up Athens' first legal code, and it was so brutally harsh that we still use the word draconian today to describe anything excessively strict. Under Draco's laws, nearly every crime, and I mean nearly every single one, was punishable by death. Stealing a cabbage. Death. When someone asked Draco why even minor offenses got the death penalty, he reportedly said small crimes deserved death, and he simply couldn't think of a worse punishment for the big one, which is either the most savage mic drop in legal history or proof that Draco just really did not want to deal with paperwork. But Athens also had this uniquely Greek punishment that didn't involve blood at all: ostracism. Once a year, citizens could vote to banish someone from the city for 10 years just by writing their name on a broken piece of pottery. No trial, no formal accusation needed, just enough people deciding they didn't like you or thought you were getting too powerful, and suddenly you're out. Exile. Your entire life uprooted, all because your neighbors ganged up and voted you off the island. It's basically ancient Survivor, except losing means you actually get shipped out of your hometown for a decade. No immunity idol required. Now let's talk about Rome, because the Romans took punishment and turned it into an entire genre of public entertainment. We all know about crucifixion, nailing or tying someone to a wooden cross and leaving them there to die slowly. Citizens got beheaded instead, which by comparison almost sounds polite. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beast, where criminals were thrown into the arena unarmed and left to be torn apart by lions, while tens of thousands of spectators cheered like it was a sporting event, because to them, it basically was. Arena executions were even scheduled between the gladiators, almost like ancient halftime entertainment. And then there's my personal favorite in the how did anyone even come up with this category? Poena culae, the punishment of the sack, reserved specifically for people who murdered a family member. The Romans would seal the murderer inside a leather sack along with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey. Yes, all 4 animals at the same time, and then throw the entire sack into a river to drown. Historians still argue about the exact symbolism, but the general idea seems to be that the criminal didn't even deserve contact with the earth, the sky, or the ocean. The elements themselves had to reject them. It is, without question, one of the most oddly specific punishments in human history, and I genuinely cannot picture the committee meeting where they decided a monkey needed to be involved. Somewhere in ancient Rome, someone had to be the guy in charge of sourcing the monkey, and I have so many questions about that job. Let's swing over to medieval Europe now, because this era gave us some of the punishments most people already picture when they think old-timey justice. Stocks, pillories, that sort of thing. And sure, getting locked in a wooden frame in the town square while people threw rotten vegetables at you sounds almost comical by comparison to what we've covered so far. But medieval punishment could get dramatically darker, fast. Take trial by ordeal, a legal system based on the belief that God would personally intervene to protect the innocent. They might make you hold a red-hot iron bar and walk several steps with it. If your burn healed cleanly within a few days, congratulations, God has spoken, you're innocent. If it got infected, well, apparently God had spoken about that too, and now you're also a convicted criminal with a horrifically infected hand. It's a justice system with essentially a built-in medical malpractice problem, and absolutely zero accountability when the verdict goes wrong. There was also trial by water, where the accused was bound and thrown into a river or pond. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. The pure water accepted. Please enjoy being fished out, hopefully before you drowned in the process of proving it. If you floated, that meant the water was rejecting you as impure, and you were guilty, which meant execution was next anyway. It's a system where roughly every outcome ends badly for you, and honestly, that alone should tell you everything about how medieval courts viewed the accused before the trial even started. And then there's the punishment most associated with high treason in medieval England, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. I won't walk you through every gruesome step, but the short version is this was designed to be the single most prolonged, most public, most humiliating execution the state could invent, specifically to make an example out of anyone who dared betray the crown. It wasn't really about killing the person efficiently. The point was that everyone in town would talk about it for the rest of their lives. Let's head east now to ancient China, where the legal system developed something called the 5 punishments, which evolved over different dynasties but generally included tattooing a criminal's face with permanent ink, marking their crime, cutting off the nose, amputating one or both feet, castration, and finally death. And in Chinese society, where your family's reputation mattered enormously and your body was considered a gift from your parents that you were expected to return intact, even the milder punishments on this list, like the facial tattoo, carried a lifetime of social shame that, in some ways, was almost worse than physical pain. You could heal from a wound. You could not untattoo your face in a society with no plastic surgery and a whole lot of judgmental neighbors. But if we're talking about Chinese execution methods, we absolutely cannot skip Ling Chi, known in the West by the deeply unpleasant nickname Death by 1,000 Cuts. This was reserved for the most severe crimes imaginable, treason, and murdering one's own parent, which Confucian society considered almost unthinkably evil. The method involved a slow, prolonged series of cuts to the body over an extended period, carried out publicly, deliberately drawn out for maximum suffering and maximum deterrent effect. It's honestly one of the more difficult punishments in this entire video to even describe without getting graphic, so I'll just say this. Of everything humans have invented to punish each other throughout history, this one consistently ranks among historians' picks for the most horrifying, and we're going to leave it there. Sticking with East Asia for a moment, feudal Japan had its own uniquely intense relationship with punishment, particularly among the samurai class. You've probably heard of seppuku, the ritual suicide samurai performed to preserve their honor rather than face public execution or disgrace. And while that's technically self-inflicted rather than a state punishment, it existed specifically because the alternative, being formally punished and shamed by the state, was considered so unbearable that death by your own hand was viewed as the more dignified option. Commoners, meanwhile, faced far more direct consequences: public crucifixion for serious crimes, boiling for particularly severe offenses, and a legal culture that placed enormous weight on group responsibility, meaning entire villages or families could face consequences for one person's actions. Ancient justice rarely stopped at the individual. Your crime was frequently treated as your family's crime, your village's crime, sometimes your entire community's problem to collectively answer for. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's swing over to ancient India for a second, where the legal text known as the Manusmriti laid out incredibly detailed punishments tied directly to the rigid caste system of the time. Punishments weren't equal across the board at all. A crime committed by someone of a lower caste against someone of a higher caste was treated with dramatically more severity than the reverse, sometimes involving mutilation for offenses that would have earned nothing more than a fine had the social positions been swapped. It's a brutal, but incredibly clear example of something that shows up constantly throughout ancient legal history. Punishment was rarely blind. It almost always reflected exactly who held power in that society and exactly who didn't. Let's swing over to the Viking world now, because Norse punishment had this uniquely brutal, almost mythological flair to it. There's a famously debated practice called the blood eat, described in a handful of Norse sagas, where a victim's ribs were supposedly cut away from the spine and their lungs pulled out through the back to resemble a pair of spread wings. Now, quick honesty break. Historians actually argue a lot about whether this was a real, regularly practiced execution or more of a poetic, symbolic exaggeration written centuries later by saga authors who liked a dramatic flourish. Either way, real or embellished, the fact that this was even a believable enough story to write down and pass around tells you a lot about how brutal Vikings wanted their reputation to be. Sometimes the myth of your punishments does just as much work as the punishments themselves. Vikings also practiced outlawry, which sounds almost gentle compared to everything else on this list, until you actually think it through. Being declared an outlaw meant you lost all legal protection under Norse law, meaning anyone could kill you, take your property, or harm you and face zero legal consequences for it, because as far as the law was concerned, you basically no longer existed as a person with rights. In a society built entirely around tight-knit communities, clan loyalty, and hospitality, being cast out like that wasn't just dangerous. For a lot of people, it was effectively a slower, more agonizing death sentence than execution, just stretched out over months of trying to survive completely alone in a brutal climate with everyone legally allowed to end you. Related Germanic tribes practiced something almost like the opposite approach, called the Vergild system, literally man price. Instead of executing someone for a crime like manslaughter, the offender's family could pay a fixed monetary compensation to the victim's family, with the exact price varying based on the social rank of the person harmed. Kill a nobleman, pay dramatically more than if you killed a commoner. In a strange way, this was actually one of the more modern feeling systems on this list, treating punishment as a financial and social transaction rather than pure physical retribution. Although obviously the built-in inequality based on someone's social class was still baked right into the price tag. Now let's cross the Atlantic to Mesoamerica, because Aztec justice deserves its own spot, mostly because it was shockingly strict for a society we usually picture through the lens of elaborate temples and dramatic religious ceremonies. Aztec law was incredibly detailed and, in some ways, surprisingly even-handed. Nobles were actually punished more harshly than commoners for the same crimes because they were expected to set a better example. Public drunkenness, for instance, was punished with death for a young person, while an elderly person might get away with it, since the elderly were permitted a bit more leniency. Adultery could be punished by death for both parties involved, and theft, depending on severity, might result in the criminal being sold into slavery to repay what they stole. Aztec society ran on incredibly rigid codes of honor and community responsibility, and their court system reflected that. Proof that even one of history's most visually spectacular civilizations still ran on brutally practical crime and punishment. Further south, the Inca Empire ran an equally strict system, built around a similar philosophy that crime disrupted the empire's overall social order. Theft, laziness, and disobedience toward local authorities were taken extremely seriously, with punishments ranging from public beatings to execution. And in especially severe cases, entire communities could be relocated or punished collectively for one individual's crime. A chilling reminder, again, of just how often ancient justice held the group responsible for what one person did. Now, before we wrap up, let's talk about a punishment method that shows up again and again across nearly every single ancient culture we've covered today, in one form or another. And it's not any specific gruesome execution. It's the trial itself, or more specifically, the lack of what we'd now call a fair one. In almost every civilization we just walked through, the accused had shockingly few rights compared to today. No presumption of innocence in most cases. No real defense attorney. Often no actual evidence requirement beyond a confession. A confession that, let's be honest, was frequently extracted through torture, which conveniently tends to produce a confession regardless of whether the person actually did any. It's honestly one of the most important through lines in this entire video. Ancient punishment wasn't really designed around figuring out the truth. It was designed around maintaining order, and a confession, real or forced, was often just the fastest route there. So why does any of this matter today? Why do we care about a bunch of brutal, outdated punishment systems from civilizations that, in most cases, ended thousands of years ago? Because if you zoom out far enough, you start to notice something kind of unsettling. The logic behind these punishments hasn't actually disappeared, it's just changed shape. Ancient societies punished publicly because public shame and public fear were incredibly effective deterrents in a world without police forces, surveillance cameras, or centralized law enforcement. Modern societies have swapped physical punishment for imprisonment in most cases, sure, but the core psychological mechanism, deterrence through fear of consequence, is still baked into basically every legal system on Earth today. Yes, I'll admit, a sack with a monkey and a snake in it is objectively wild content. It's that these punishments are basically a mirror. They tell you what a society valued most, what it feared most, and what it was willing to do to protect that value. Babylon valued property and family structure so intensely they'd execute your children for your mistakes. Egypt valued cosmic order so deeply that eternal burial denial was considered worse than death itself. Rome valued public spectacle and state control so much they turned executions into full-blown entertainment events with paid seating. China valued family honor and bodily wholeness so intensely that permanent physical marking was treated as a lifelong punishment on its own. India's punishments mapped almost perfectly onto its social hierarchy, and the Vikings valued community belonging so much that losing it was treated as worse than death. Every single method we covered today isn't random cruelty. It's a window into exactly what that civilization was terrified of losing. So next time you're sitting in traffic court arguing about a parking ticket or filling out some mildly annoying form because you forgot to renew something on time, maybe take just a second to appreciate that nobody's about to throw you in a sack with a rooster and a snake and toss you in a river. We've come a long way. Not perfectly, Modern justice systems absolutely still have massive, serious problems worth talking about. But compared to 6,000 years of human beings inventing increasingly creative ways to make examples out of each other in public squares, I think we can all agree things are, relatively speaking, looking up.